سيدنا ونبينا محمد حبيب رب العالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah, Sharh Nur al-Idah, we've reached the section on Tarawih prayers. So, Tarawih prayer is the Sunnah of Ramadan, right? It's the Sunnah of Ramadan. And it has great virtues. The majority of the scholars mention that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, "Man qama Ramadan imanan wa ihtisaba, ghufira lahu ma taqaddama min dhanbih." Whoever stands in Ramadan out of faith and sincerely seeking the reward from Allah, imanan wa ihtisaba, all their past sins will be forgiven. That's referring most specifically to Tarawih, right? And it's attained by the consistent performing of Tarawih in any Ramadan, right? The hadith is unconditioned insofar as standing in congregation or not. So the reward of that is attained whether in congregation or not, as we will see. But it's a tremendous promised reward, so it should not be neglected. So now there is some stirred controversy about the number of rak'ahs of Tarawih. It is sufficient to know that what we'll be looking at, the position of all four schools has settled on Tarawih being 20 rak'ahs. The significant difference is in the Maliki school, you could do more than that as well. You could do more than that as well. That's not a point of deen insofar as being a sunnah. In our madhab, it's a sunnah mu'akkada. It's an emphasized sunnah. In other schools, the leaving of the sunnah mu'akkada is less grave, right? And how specific the 20 rak'ahs is, especially in the Maliki school, there's some discussion about that. But insisting that 8 rak'ahs is the sunnah would be a divergence from the way of the Muslims. One should not get into disputes about these things, but it's sufficient to say that in all four madhabs, the settled position is that 20 rak'ahs is sunnah. There are hadiths, and Tahtawi mentions a bunch of these hadiths about 8 rak'ahs. The 8 rak'ahs are understood to refer to the tahajjud of the Prophet ﷺ, not the Tarawih itself. One of the best treatises on the subject is by Imam Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi, where he goes through the evidentiary basis of the 20 rak'ahs, etc. First he defines what is the sunnah and establishes that the sunnah is established also by the practice of the khulafa. But Sayyidina Umar would not have instituted 20 rak'ahs except with clear evidentiary basis from the Prophet ﷺ, and the Sahaba did not object. So the institutionalizing of 20 rak'ahs by Sayyidina Umar is understood by the practice of the Sahaba, not just the acceptance of the Sahaba as being in accordance with the Sunnah of the Prophet. Because had he done something that they felt was at variance with the practice of the Prophet, they would not have agreed. That's an important treatise. Some people misquote Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam on this point by saying that, well, Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam says 8 rak'ahs are sunnah mu'akkada and 20 are recommended. That's not what Kamal ibn al-Humam is saying. And the way that's understood is that he just raises an issue, and Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam does this, that says, what if it were said that 8 are an emphasized sunnah and the rest are because it's established from the Prophet ﷺ, and 20 are recommended because they're established from the Sahaba, and that's what's called bahthan. That's just he opens a point of debate or discussion, and the answer is no. number one, that it's established from the Sahaba only because it has a basis from the Prophet ﷺ. And number two, the Sunnah, just as it's established by the practice of the Prophet ﷺ directly, also what is the practice of the Sahaba, whether it be the senior Sahaba or the generality of the Sahaba, also establishes the Sunnah in our madhab. Right? That's important to be aware of. And this has been the al-mutawarith عند المسلمين. Right? This has been the inherited position of the Muslims. So, but don't argue about religion. So he says, فصل في صلاة التراويح, the chapter on praying Tarawih. التراويح سنة على الرجال والنساء. Right? So he says, الترويحة الجلسة في الأصل. The ترويحة is sitting for rest. ثم سميت بها الأربع ركعات التي آخرها الترويحة. And then the word tarwih, so tarwiha refers to sitting for rest, and then the 4 rak'ahs after which one sits and rests has been called a tarwiha. And tarawih is the plural of it, because there are multiple sitting for rests. روى الحسن عن أبي حنيفة صفتها بقوله التراويح السنة. Right? And Al-Hasan relates from Abu Hanifa that its sifa, its characteristic, meaning its ruling, that it is a sunnah كما في الخلاصة وهي مؤكدة, and it's a sunnah مؤكدة كما في الاختيار, as mentioned in the اختيار and عامة الكتب, in the generality of our books. وروى أسد بن عمرو عن أبي يوسف أنه قال سألت أبا حنيفة عن التراويح فقال إني وما فعله عمر رضي الله عنه فقال التراويح السنة المؤكدة ولم يتخرصه عمر من تلقاء نفسه. Right? And Asad ibn Amr relates from Abu Yusuf, the senior most student of Abu Hanifa, that he asked Abu Hanifa about Tarawih and what Sayyidina Umar did in terms of gathering the companions on one Imam and making it 20 and specifying 20 rak'ahs. So Abu Hanifa said Tarawih is an emphasized sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and Umar did not make it up from himself. Right? وَلَمْ يَكُنْ فِيهِ مُبْتَدِعًا, and he did not make an innovation in this matter. وَلَمْ يَأْمُرْ بِهِ إِلَّا عَنْ أَصْلٍ لَدَيْهِ, and he did not command its performance except on the basis of a principle established in Sayyidina Umar. أصل أصل من السنة, a principle in the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. وَعْهَدِ النَّبِي, and from what he understood from the Prophet ﷺ. Right? And the agreement وَمُوَافَقَةُ الصَّحَابَةِ شاهد لذلك. Right? And the Sahaba agreeing شاهد بذلك is a proof for that. وهي سنة مؤكدة على الرجال والنساء. It's an emphasized sunnah for both men and women. Right? ثبتت سنيتها بفعل النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. It's being a sunnah is established by the practice of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. وقوله, and his words as well. And what are the words? قال عليه الصلاة والسلام عليكم بسنتي وسنة الخلفاء الراشدين من بعدي. Hold fast to my sunnah and the sunnah of the Khulafa al-Rashideen after me. Right? وقد واظب عليها عمر وعثمان وعلي, and its public performance was done consistently by Umar and Uthman and Ali رضي الله تعالى عنهم. وقال صلى الله عليه وسلم في حديث افترض الله عليكم صيامه وسننت لكم قيامه. And the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم said, Allah made its fasting obligatory for you, and I made its standing a sunnah for you. And what is its standing? It's Tarawih. وفيه رد لقول بعض الروافض, and in this is a refutation of the position of some of the Rawafid, of some of the Shia who said he has sunnatul rijal dun al-nisa, that is sunnah for men, not women. وَقَوْلِ بَعْضِهِمْ سُنَّةُ عُمَرٍ, and it's also a refutation of those who say it's a sunnah of Umar. If they mean by it that it's a sunnah of Umar, disconnected from the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, right? Right? And we've seen what Abu Hanifa said about that. Umar did not make it up himself, right? He simply institutionalized what he understood was the example of the Prophet ﷺ, right? He institutionalized it and he established the public congregation for it. لأن الصحيح أنها سنة النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, because the sound opinion is that it is the sunnah of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. And there's useful footnotes here from Imam al-Tahtawi. The hadithi discussions are stronger in Imam Lakhnawi's treatise than they are in Tahtawi, but Tahtawi has, and a lot of it he's taking it would seem, from the Bahr al-Ra'iq, which the Bahr al-Ra'iq and the Fath, and the Halba of Ibn Amir Hajj. والجماعة فيها والجماعة سنة فيها أيضا لكن على الكفاية. Congregational, performing the Tarawih in congregation is also sunnah, but collectively, meaning that establishing for each community to establish Salat al-Tarawih in congregation is a sunnah upon them, such that sunnah mu'akkada for them, such that if any community were to leave establishing in normal circumstances Salat al-Tarawih, they would have left and emphasized sunnah, because it's become one of the sha'air of the deen, right? It's, in that sense, it's blameworthy to leave. But it is individually, the congregation is recommended. It's sunnah mu'akkada ala al-kifaya, mustahabbatun ala al-a'yan, and individually recommended to do in congregation. بينه بقوله وصلاتها جماعة سنة كفاية. وصلاتها بالجماعة سنة كفاية, and performing it in congregation is a collective sunnah and individually recommended. Right? And there's some furu' that are rarely mentioned in Tahtawi. He quotes al-Marghinani that leading 2 Tarawihs in one night is makruh. But praying 2 Tarawihs in one night is not makruh, meaning even in congregation. And there's some other details there. Right? Now, one of the things, Imam Lakhnawi's treatise is very good, but it is not established that the jama'ah in it is emphasized sunnah on the individual. Right? What's mentioned in Shurun Bulali, Tahtawi, Hashid ibn Abdin, most of the later work is that the jama'ah is individually recommended. It's a recommended sunnah, not an emphasized sunnah. That's one of the points that differing with the treatise of Imam Lakhnawi, but it's a very beneficial treatise. لما ثبت أنه صلى الله عليه وسلم صلى بالجماعة 11 ركعة بالوتر, because it's established the Prophet ﷺ prayed in congregation 11 rak'ahs including witr, right? على سبيل التداعي, and the people were called to it. ولم يجرها مجرى سائر النوافل, and he did not perform it like the other nafil prayers, where anytime there was nafil done in congregation, it was not done consistently and people weren't called to it, like he was praying at home or in the masjid, someone joined in. right? But they didn't call to it, تداعي. ثم بين العذر في الترك وهو خشيته افتراضها علينا. And then the Prophet ﷺ, when he didn't lead them in it, he explained the excuse for not doing it, which is the, the fear that it be deemed obligatory upon us. وقال الصدر الشهيد الجماعة سنة كفاية فيها حتى لو أقامها البعض في المسجد بجماعة وباقي أهل المحلة أقامها منفردا في بيته لا يكون تاركا للسنة. And the congregation in it is a collective sunnah in it, such that if some establish the congregation in the masjid and others pray it alone, they will not be leaving the sunnah, meaning they emphasize sunnah. لأنه يروى عن أفراد الصحابة التخلف, because it's narrated from individual companions that they prayed it on their own, and if it were emphasized that you have to do it in congregation, they would not have done so. وقال في المبسوط لو صلى إنسان في بيته لا يأثم فقد فعله ابن عمر وعروة. And if a person prayed it at his house, meaning not in congregation, it's not sinful. Right? And you know, the supposition is what? That leaving the emphasized sunnah consistently without excuse is sinful. Because Ibn Umar and Urwa prayed it at home. وسالم والقاسم وإبراهيم ونافع. Right? And فدل فعل هؤلاء أن الجماعة في المسجد سنة على سبيل الكفاية. So the actions of those indicate that praying it in congregation in the masjid is a collective sunnah. إذ لا يظن بابن عمر ومن تبعه ترك السنة. But it cannot be imagined from the likes of Ibn Umar, who is particularly known for how comprehensively he followed the sunnah, even when on some things you wouldn't understand why the case was, right? Even once, you know, he was walking in the desert and he bowed and continued walking, and people said, why do you bow? He said, because there used to be a tree here, and the Prophet ﷺ bowed to walk under it and then continued walking. The tree was no longer there, but when he passed by that place, he bowed and stood up because the Prophet ﷺ did so. That's his degree of following the sunnah. رضي الله تعالى عنه. فإن الأداء في المسجد وإن صلاها بجماعة في بيته فالصحيح أنه نال إحدى الفضيلتين. And if one prays in congregation in one's house, the sound opinion is one attained one of two virtues. فإن الأداء في المسجد له فضيلة ليس للأداء في البيت, because the virtue of praying it in the masjid has the praying in the masjid has a virtue that is not there in praying it at home. وكذا الحكم في الفرائض. And likewise the ruling of the fard, unless there's a preponderating consideration, right? That al-jama'a al-khassa, you know, there could be some wajh of tarjih in it, right? Like if it's in a, like people are in a madrasa and they're between classes, etc. So that jama'ah, yeah, they don't lose out on the reward of the congregation. They get the reward of the congregation, but there's a contingent consideration, right? Because if they all went to the masjid, came back, they would lose from class time. That's why the madrasas, you know, the custom is that they would pray most of their salawat there, right? For obvious reasons. Now, if the madrasa could also have a formal masjid within it, but that's not always feasible, right? ووقتها ما بعد صلاة العشاء على الصحيح إلى طلوع الفجر. The time of Isha is after Salat al-Isha, according to the sound opinion, until sunrise. Right? So you can only perform it once the Isha prayer has been performed. Right? لتبعيتها للعشاء يصح تقديم الوتر على التراويح. And because it follows Isha, that if you've performed Isha, you can perform Tarawih. It is valid to pray witr first and then Tarawih. Let's say someone was working late, they prayed Isha at work, they got to the masjid, or they prayed Isha at work and they prayed Witr as they normally do, and then on their way home they saw they're praying Tarawih in the masjid, so you could join in, for example. وَتَأْخِيرُهُ عَنْهَا, and you can also pray Witr after Tarawih, which is the superior. وهو أفضل, right? حتى لو تبين فساد العشاء دون التراويح والوتر أعادوا العشاء ثم الوتر ثم التراويح دون الوتر عند أبي حنيفة. So much so that if it becomes, they realize that the Isha was invalid, but the Tarawih was valid, and so was Witr. One repeats the Isha and then the Tarawih, because the Tarawih needs to come after Isha. But you wouldn't have to repeat the Witr according to Abu Hanifa. لِوُقُوعِهَا نَافِلَةً مُطْلَقًا. In this case, the Tarawih would count as an unconditional nafil. بِوُقُوعِهَا فِي غَيْرِ مَحَلِّهَا, because it occurred in other than its place. Because what is the place of Tarawih? After Isha. That's why, what is the time of Witr? Yeah, right? The time of Witr is the time of Isha, but the order between them is fard amali. But yasqut bil udhr, right? But the order is lifted when there's excuse, and we've taken that. That's why these subtleties, one needs to have ضبط of them. Okay. وقال جماعة من أصحابنا منهم إسماعيل الزاهد إن الليل كله وقت لها قبل العشاء وبعده. And some of the Hanafis said, right? And this is not musahhah, right? As Al-Tahtawi mentions from Al-Bahr Al-Ra'iq, that I haven't seen who has deemed it sahih. So it's not just asah and sahih. This is a weaker opinion in the madhab. But why is this relevant? Because if you see someone do this and they're unlearned, there are positions within the madhab. So it's not that it's fine, but you don't have to correct them necessarily, right? Especially if they don't know. Sometimes the ulama mention these, not that they can be acted upon by choice, but does it fall under amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar? No. And usually there's khilaf within our madhab, there'll also be khilaf with other madhabs, right? Typically, right? Also, it becomes a lesser nasiha, right? Even someone's Hanafi, but they don't know, right? What's the priority? They should learn their deen, right? Right? That's why things like this are often mentioned. But if you see something like that, it's good to ask that, okay, this opinion, what is its scope? Okay. ويستحب تأخير التراويح إلى قبيل ثلث الليل أو قبيل نصفه. Right? It's recommended, meaning in itself, right? To delay Tarawih till a third of the night or till before half the night, as long as it doesn't become heavy on the people, right? And they say, and there's difference exactly how much one delays it. It would follow the delay of Isha, right? بقدر ما يجتمع فيه القوم, such that people would be able to gather. And it would appear that they used to delay Isha more in Ramadan than other times, because people would gather to break their fasts, etc., etc. So in accordance with that, which facilitate for people to eat and then be able to make it eat and maybe rest a little bit to prepare for the tul al-qiyam. But at the same time, not such ما لم يشق على القوم, right? As long as it doesn't become a burden for the people, right? As some of the other commentators mention. واختلفوا في أدائها بعد النصف, and they differ on performing it after half the night, meaning in the congregation. فقال بعضهم يكره لأنها تبع للعشاء. Some said that it would be disliked to delay it past half the night because it follows Isha. فَصَارَتْ كَسُنَّةِ الْعِشَاء. So it becomes like the sunnah of Isha. So one delays it like the delay of Isha, somewhat would be fine. But delaying it to the second half of the night would be a burden on people and would be considered unduly delaying, because Isha is makruh to delay to the second half of the night for the congregation because of some textual evidence and an illegal basis, which is يؤدي إلى تقليل الجماعة, would lead to the jama'ah becoming stronger, smaller. But in some places what they do, that in the same city, if some people are doing it at the early times, they also have some people doing it later, some people earlier, so that different people, they have sort of a menu of Tarawih choices. وقال بعضهم لا يكره تأخيرها إلى ما بعده أي بعد نصف الليل على الصحيح. And others said that it's not disliked to delay it till after half the night, according to sound opinion. In itself, again, unless it leads to the diminishing of the congregation or becomes a burden on people. لأن أفضل صلاة الليل آخره, because the best of the night prayer is the end of the night. في حد ذاتها, in of itself. ولكن الأحب أن لا يؤخر التراويح خشية الفوات. But it's best that one does not delay Tarawih, meaning too much, lest one miss it. Right? So say someone's feeling lazy and say, well, let me get some rest and pray. The spiritual discipline for the individual will be pray it and then get some rest. Right? So that you don't risk fulfilling your duty. Right? So he says, وَهِيَ 20 رَكَعَةٍ. It is 20 rak'ahs. بِإِجْمَاعِ الصَّحَابَةِ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى عنْهُمْ. By the ijma', the consensus, the practical consensus. This ijma' amali. Right? Right? And you'll see that this is not recognized as ijma' by everybody. بعشر تسليمات, with 10 taslims, كما هو المتوارث, as is customary, as is inherited. يسلم على رأس كل ركعتين. One gives salams after each 2 rak'ahs. فإذا وصلها وجلس على كل شفع فالأصح أنه إن تعمد ذلك كره. But if one connects them and sits after each 2 rak'ahs but gives salams only at the 4th rak'ah, if the sounder opinion is that if one does so deliberately, it's makruh. وصحت, but it's valid. وأجزأته, and it counts. عن كلها, it counts as the 20 rak'ahs. Right? And there is an opinion that it is not makruh and that it's even better. And you can see it in Tahtawi quoting Munyat al-Musalli. But it is not accepted because what is superior is that which corresponds to the sunnah. And what corresponds to the sunnah and the practice of the Sahaba is 2 by 2 for Tarawih. 2 by 2, stop at 4. 2 by 2, stop at 4. But there is an opinion there. It's not just a free choice, right? But there's an opinion there. Someone who does it is not acting outside the Hanafi school fully, but that's not the relied upon position in the school. وإذا لم يجلس إلا في آخر 4 نابت عن تسليمة. But if one only sits after, if only sits at 4 rak'ahs, then it counts only as one set of 2 rak'ahs. فتكون بمنزلة ركعتين في الصحيح. So it will count as if it is 2 rak'ahs. Right? ويسحب الجلوس بعد صلاة كل 4 ركعات بقدرها. It's recommended to sit after each set of 4 rak'ahs to the extent of the 4 rak'ahs. If people are able to do so, right? Because that's where the name comes from. وكذا يستحب الجلوس بقدرها بين الترويحة الخامسة والوتر. And it's also recommended likewise to sit that extent between the end of the Tarawih prayer and witr as well, to sit, right? And what does one do? بين الترويحة الخامسة والوتر لأنه المتوارث عن السلف, because that's what's transmitted from the Salaf, but that's not it. Because that's where the word Tarawih comes from, right? That what was the practice of the Prophet ﷺ? He'd pray, sit and pause, and you can do multiple things. During that time, one can either engage in reflection or remembrance or personal prayer or Quran or a reminder or some mix thereof. Right? وهذا روي عن أبي حنيفة رحمه الله. This is what's related from Abu Hanifa رحمه الله. ولأن اسم التراويح ينبئ عن ذلك. And because the word Tarawih comes from this. وهم مخيرون في الجلوس بين التسبيح والقراءة والصلاة فرادى والسكوت. And they have a choice in that sitting between tasbih or recitation or individual prayer or silence and tadhkir as well. And then he says ويسن ختم القرآن فيها. It's a sunnah mustahabba to do khatm of the Quran in it, in Tarawih. مرة في الشهر على الصحيح. Once in the month on what is the sound opinion. Right? Right? And if one could do 2 or 3, it's superior, as mentioned in Tahtawi. Right? In of itself, superior. Right? مرة في الشهر. Tahtawi mentions that, quoting al-Kafi. This is the Kafi of al-Nasafi, of course. وهو قول الأكثر. This is the opinion of most of the ulama. رواه الحسن عن أبي حنيفة. Related by al-Hasan ibn Ziyad from Abu Hanifa. يقرأ في كل ركعة 10 آيات أو نحوها. And one recites about 10 rak'ahs, 10 verses in each rak'ah. Thereabouts, right? But it depends. And there's different ways the huffaz know how to divide. But basically, 29 or 30 nights of Ramadan, 600 rak'ahs, slightly over 6,000 verses of the Quran. So it works out 10 verses per rak'ah, but it also depends. So there's a few different ways. What's been inherited, one does a juz and a little bit per night to get it done, even in case. So generally people made a habit to finish on the night of the 27th. Some would finish on the night of the 29th. Some would finish on the night of the 25th. So one would divide it accordingly. أو نحوها, or the like of it. وعن أبي حنيفة رحمه الله أنه كان يختم في رمضان 61 ختمة. It's related from Abu Hanifa that he'd finish 61 khatams in Ramadan. في كل يوم ختمة وفي كل ليلة ختمة. Each day a khatam and each night a khatam. وفي كل التراويح ختمة. And in all the tarawih in the public congregation, 1 khatam. وصلى بالقرآن في ركعتين. It's also related from him separately that he recited the whole Quran in 2 rak'ahs. وصلى الفجر بوضوء العشاء 40 سنة. And he prayed Fajr with the wudu he had for Isha 40 years. Meaning that the sleep he had at night was just seated. Right? Is brief and seated. And of course, this issue is addressed by Imam al-Nawawi in his Tibyan في بيان آداب حملة القرآن, where he shows that so many of the Sahaba are narrated to have recited soundly, the authentic transmission, not just hik. There's also a good book by Imam al-Qurtubi on the adab of the Quran, and also by Ibn Kathir and many others, all of which narrate numerous companions who did khatm of the Quran daily or every other day or every, so the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that whoever finishes the Quran in less than 3 days has not given it its due, there's a few narrations, that's generally, because most people have their worldly occupation and so on, so they wouldn't give it its due. They would either rush it or not reflect on it. But if one doesn't rush it and does reflect on it, and one has attentiveness and it would not overwhelm them, Yeah, so that they could not be consistent in the like of it, then there's no dislike and it's established. Likewise, Imam Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi's treatise on this, إقامة الحجة على أن الإكثار من التعبد ليس ببدعة, is excellent on bid'ah, and also deflecting this, one of the literalist arguments that emerged in his time and has stuck in different people, that anything, if you do something that the Prophet did not do or did not do as much of, somehow it's a bid'ah. And that's not correct. You see that? And he brought both legal evidence and textual evidence to the contrary. Right? So that's again on the reading list of a student of knowledge. Yeah? And Imam Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi, despite some unique stances and some of it, like legal opinions are taken from their sources, but these treatises of Imam al-Laknawi are brilliant. Some more brilliant than others, like this one. Rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi. وَإِنْ مَلَّ بِهِ أي بختم القرآن في الشهر القوم قرأ بقدر ما لا يؤدي إلى تنفيرهم. And if the people would find it heavy to finish the whole Quran in a month, then one leads them in the extent that would not cause them to be turned away. في المختار, according to the chosen opinion. This is the mu'tamad in the madhab. لأن الأفضل في زماننا ما لا يؤدي إلى تنفير الجماعة, because the best in our times, and he's writing almost 400 years ago, right? 380 years ago roughly is when Imam Shurmbulali passed away, Hijri. And he says في زماننا, right? And people before said this. كذا في الاختيار. Imam al-Mawsili, when did he die? 683 Hijri. That's almost 800 years ago, 770 years ago or something, right? 760 years ago. وفي المحيط البرهاني الأفضل في زماننا أن يقرأ بما لا يؤدي إلى تنفير القوم عن الجماعة. And in المحيط it also says the best in our times, and the محيط before that is to recite an extent that would not turn people away from the congregation. And the people, it's not just al-ulama and the salihin, it's عامة الناس, it's the common person. المخاطبين بصلاة الجماعة, of those whom, if it was made accessible, would attend. Right? Right? لأن تكثير القوم أفضل من تطويل القراءة, because having a larger congregation without doing anything blameworthy is superior than lengthy recitation. وبه يفتى, and this is the fatwa position. وقال الزاهدي يقرأ كما في المغرب, one recites to the extent of Maghrib. These are other opinions. And أي القصار المفصل بعد الفاتحة, and the short مفصل after the Fatiha. ويكره الاختصار على ما دون 3 آيات. It's makruh to recite less than 3 verses, because then you're leaving a wajib. أو آية طويلة بعد الفاتحة لترك الواجب, or a long verse after the Fatiha because you're leaving the wajib. Right? ولا يترك. Now, because there are some people who said, okay, if needed, you can recite just 1 verse, and you know, you can leave all the sunnah. There are fatwa positions given on this in the madhab, right, in the books of fatawa, but that's not relied upon in the madhab, right? And we say, okay, that may be particular to their circumstances, whatever, but it cannot be generalized, right? And if people do it in certain areas, ask the muftis of that particular area, because that's not the general position of the madhab, right? Some places they do that in the marketplace, because a lot of people would go shopping at night in Ramadan. So a lot of traders, etc., would miss Jama'ah. So people gave fatwa, okay, you can do Tarawih even with 1 rak'ah, and you can miss the Sunan Mu'akkada. Just get it done. Why? Because man qama Ramadan, whoever stands in worship in Ramadan, if you do that 20 rak'ahs, you did the Qiyam of Ramadan. So it's Fath Bab al-Khair. But that's not the mu'tamad in our. Some schools would allow that, so it's not something to object to. And there are masajid where literally I mentioned Jami' al-Hanabila in Damascus, they used to read the first 20 verses of Surah al-Rahman in over 20 verses, over 20 rak'ahs. Ar-Rahman, Allahu Akbar. Like Fatiha, the word Ar-Rahman. Right? One verse each rak'ah. They're short verses too. I stepped out after 2 rak'ahs. I wanted to walk out of the first one, but it's wajib to complete it. ولا يترك الصلاة على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم في كل تشهد منها. And one does not leave sending blessings on the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم in every tashahhud because it's sunnah mu'akkada. So one does not leave the wajib, one does not leave the sunnah mu'akkada. لأنها سنة مؤكدة عندنا وفرض على قول بعض المجتهدين. And فرض according to some mujtahids. Right? فلا يصح عندهم بدونها. It's not valid according to them without it. ويحذر من الهدرمة. And the imam should beware of rushing. Right? It can be with a dal or a dhal. Right? Which is excessively fast recitation. Right? Hadrama is excessively fast recitation such that results in either mispronunciation or it's not clearly understood what you're reciting. وَتَرْكِ التَّرْتِيل, and leaving reciting with tartil. وَتَرْكِ تَعْدِيلِ الْأَرْكَانِ, or not being motionless in each of the integrals. وَغَيْرِهَا كَمَا يَفْعَلُهُ مَنْ لَا خَشْيَةَ لَهُ, and other things that are done by those who have no awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَوْ مَلَّ الْقَوْمِ بِذَلِكَ عَلَى الْمُخْتَارِ, even if people find it heavy according to chosen opinion, because one accommodates people but not by leaving the emphasized sunnah. لأنه عين الكسل, because that is from laziness itself. منهم, from them. فلا يلتف إليهم فيه, so one does not join them in that expression of laziness. وكذا لا يترك الثناء في افتتاح كل شفع وكذا تسبيح الركوع والسجود, and likewise one does not leave the opening invocation in every pair of rak'ahs, and likewise one does not leave the tasbih of ruku' and the sujood is not left because these are sunnah muakkadas in our madhab. So the principle is one does not leave the wajib of the prayer nor the sunnah muakkada. And it adds to it لِافْتِرَاضِهِ عِنْدَ الْبَعْضِ, because some deem these tasbihs to be fard, although it's not a strong opinion, but it's basic caution, right? Abu Muti'in al-Balkhi, student of Imam Abu Hanifa. وَتَأْكِيدِ سُنَّتِهِ عِنْدَنَا, and because of how emphasized the sunnah is according to us. وَلَا يَأْتِي الْإِمَامِ بِالدُّعَاءِ عِنْدَ السَّلَامِ إِنْ مَلَّ الْقَوْمِ بِهِ, and the imam does not recite dua in it if the people find that heavy. وَلَا يَتْرُكُهُ بِالْمَرَّةِ, but one does not leave it completely. So here he couches what he says in the matan in the sharh, meaning one does not do the complete dua, like the dua of Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu, for example. Right? So one does not do the dua, meaning لا يأتي بالدعاء أي التام, like the complete dua. Because the sunnah, after the sunnah muakkada, what is it? Is any dua before the salam, right? Within the prayer, any dua is sunnah muakkada. The specific duas, like what's the dua of Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq? اللهم إني ظلمت نفسي ظلما كثيرا ولا يغفر الذنوب إلا أنت فاغفر لي مغفرة من عندك وارحمني إنك أنت الغفور الرحيم. That, what is its ruling? That's any of the specific sunnah du'as is recommended, but you can make dua yourself. Any dua is sufficient there. So you could just say astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, or any brief dua. That's why he says in the commentary, right, وَلَا يَتْرُكُهُ بِالْمَرَّةِ, one does not leave it completely. فَيَدْعُو بِمَا قَصُرَ تَحْصِيلًا لِلسُّنَّةِ, so one makes a short dua to attain the sunnah. وَلَا تُقْضَى التَّرَوِيحِ أَصْلًا, the tarawih cannot be made up, right? The only sunnah that is legally made up is the sunnah of Fajr, if made up with its fard before Zawal on the same day. That's the only sunnah that is made up. but one can compensate for it by doing the like of it as a nafil to make up for the missed reward. Right? But that does not count as qada. Right? It's not a legal makeup. One is trying to do what one can. And that is recommended. So there is no qada of the sunnah except for the sunnah of fajr as described. But it is recommended to do an equivalent number of rak'ahs listidraki ma fat, to compensate for what one missed out for. Right? And in hope of Allah rewarding you fully by this expression. And also to maintain one's routines. Right? To maintain one's routines. So that's not neglected. And the ulama mentioned that. Right? Aslan. If missed from its time, munfaridan wala bi jama'ah, whether alone or in congregation, such that, if there's some public calamity or something, they weren't able to pray Tarawih, there's a fire in the village or whatever, can they do it next day at duha time? No. Ala al-asah, according to the more sound opinion. لأن القضاء من خصائص الواجبات, because qada is unique to things that are in your duty. Does it stick in your dues? Right? If you think of the dhimma, the fard and the wajib enter the dhimma and remain there until discharged. The sunnah doesn't enter, it sort of hangs over. It hangs over. In the time you have this opportunity, you can pluck it and sort of put the reward in the bucket, in the container. If you don't pluck it in the time, it goes. It goes. وَإِن قَضَاهَا, but if one makes it up, right? كانت نفلا مستحبا. Right? This is frequently neglected, right? Put notes here, right? Right? If one makes it up, كانت نفلا مستحبا. It's a recommended nafil. Not Tarawih. Not Tarawih. Right? And it does fall under the general realization of, say, the Aisha, that كان النبي صلى الله كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا نام عن حزبه من الليل قضاه بعد طلوع الشمس. Right? أو كما قالت رضي الله تعالى عنها. That the Prophet ﷺ, he missed anything of his night routine of worship, he would make it up after sunrise. But that is not qada in the legal sense. وهي سنة الوقت, and Tarawih is a sunnah of the time, لا سنة الصوم في الأصح, not the sunnah of fasting. فمن صار أهلا للصلاة في آخر اليوم تسن له التراويح. So anyone who's fit to pray at the end of the day is of those for whom witr is encouraged. كالحائض, like a menstruating woman, her haid finished at maghrib time or during isha time, she didn't fast that day, etc. It's sunnah for her to do tarawih that day. والمسافر والمريض المفطر, or a traveler or a sick person who is not fasting, it is sunnah for them to do tarawih. So this is now there's a few rulings that are mentioned in Hashit al-Tahtawi, right? One of them is blameworthy. So one is, if people give up on, there's the first of the furu', it quotes the Qunya, that if people leave Isha congregation, then they can't gather just for Tarawih. But this is different. But when does this apply? If people say, okay, let's get together and do Tarawih. Everyone pray Isha at home, let's get together, do Tarawih in congregation. They should be banned from doing that. Rather we say, look, get together, do Isha together, and then go home and do Tarawih. Right? Because which is greater in reward? But if someone, but this does not apply to the one who, if someone, they got caught in traffic, and what do? Can you still pray Tarawih in congregation? Yes, but you have to pray Isha first. Right? So that's not what it's referring to, right? And it's disliked to sit down in Tarawih out of laziness and just get up before ruku' out of laziness, right? But this is if it's done out of laziness, right? If someone has an excuse, whatever, and if one is overcome by sleep, it's better to be awake before one prays, because of the hadith of Sayyidah Zainab. She kept a rope in the masjid to hold on to be able to pray extensively in the masjid. The Prophet ﷺ had the rope taken down, and he said one should pray when one is awake and aware, right? And so there's useful things. So we finished in our copy volume 1, but volume 2 is significantly smaller, and we've read bits of it from Kitab al-Sawm. But the next issue, which we won't be starting today, is prayer in the Kaaba, and then the prayer of the traveler. So we'll get to the prayer of the traveler, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and then when we open it, we'll take the various modes of travel, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and then we have the prayer of the sick, right? So let's get ahead in preparing, and then there's some important closing chapters coming up, and sujood al-tilawa. Some of these are quite straightforward, so you'll find that, there's an accelerative element to it, and we'll have to somehow connect to what we've done for fasting. So you guys can propose something. So we'll stop here. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. Any quick questions?
What is the ruling of the dua that most people do between the 4 rakahs in Tarawih?
Well, I don't know what most people do.
It's Subhana dhil mulki wal malakut, Subhana dhil izzati wal malakuti.
No. So it's a dua. Right? It's a dua. It's mutawarath. There are various du'as from the Salaf and from various hadiths from which someone at some point gathered these together. Right? They found benefit in it, right? To get people making dhikr between the tower. Because if you let common people alone, what will they do? They'll start talking to one another. Okay, let's go grab a drink, let's go grab a snack, let's grab a samosa at the back. You say, Subhana dhil mulki wal malakut. This is just, this is minal a'mal, it's a dhikr. So it is a specific way of practicing a general sunnah. It is not, there's no hadith that establishes this, nor any specific one text from the Sahaba. But there's no issue with that. The ulama, it became mutawarith and people found benefit in it. There's no harm in it.
What is the ruling for women to attend the Jama'ah or Tarawih? Is it also Muslim? And I noticed in our time, many masajid, they have the sunnah or the recommended recitation, which is the khatam, but I haven't attended a single Tarawih
No, 'cause so the mustahab sitting, it's it's optimally that long, but practically they tend to do it smaller because the experience is that if let's say each four rak'ahs takes 20 minutes. If you pause for 20, people just go away. So you have to be, again, the same idea of إذا مل القوم, you'd reduce it for that reason, right? So but have at least a little bit of a pause, right? In many places in Damascus, generally after 8 rak'ah they'd have a reminder, right? They do some dhikr between each of them, but there'll also be the fear, if you pause too long, people start leaving. That's just so we'll stop there. We need to pray Maghrib. Yes.
There is a question online. Is it a sunnah to do thana in the third rak'ah of غير مؤكدة prayer, but not so in the mu'akkada prayer?
Yes, so we covered that in the section on the nawafil. You could link to the lesson on the ahkam of the nafil. It comes up, right, that if the 4 rak'ah non-emphasized sunnah, right, which sunnah ghair mu'akkada, or the nafil, if you're praying it as 4 rak'ahs with 1 salam, in the 3rd rak'ah you would do the thana and the ta'awudh in it. And there's ikhtilaf about the ta'awudh. And you would recite, in the 2nd rak'ah, you would recite the Salat al-Ibrahimiyya after the tashahhud. But in the sunnah mu'akkada, because it's the sunnah mu'akkada, if it's 4 rak'ahs, like the one before dhuhr and before Jumu'ah and after Jumu'ah, that is 1 unit of 4 rak'ahs. So you wouldn't do the Salat al-Ibrahimiyya after 2 rak'ahs, and you wouldn't do the opening invocation after the 3rd, because it's not like 2 units. But besides sunnah mu'akkada 4 rak'ahs, in the other sunnah and nawafil, you would do those because they are like 2 rak'ahs. Like each set of rak'ahs are like a prayer on their own. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.